Welcome to my brown bag, How to Lose Friends and Hinder Success. I hope to try to get through this in about a half an hour, maybe a little bit more or less. And I hope to do it somehow smoothly because I'm trying to look at a couple of different screens here, see my notes and the screen. So, first of all, some of you may find it obvious why I named the brown bag what I did, How to Lose Friends and Hinder Success. Others may not be so obvious. Either way, does anybody know, and you can just shout out if you do, who this guy is?
Dale.
Daniel, is that what you said? No,
That's
it's not
Dale.
Daniel.
Dale.
It's actually
Dale Earnhardt.
Dale. Very good. It's Dale Carnegie, actually. Dale Carnegie, for those of you who don't know, was an American writer and lecturer who died in 1955, actually, at the age of 66. It seems like a really long time ago, so you may be wondering, why is that relevant for our discussion today? Well, part of the reason is Dale Carnegie was a developer of these courses in what we now call self-help. So he developed these courses where people would actually attend seminars to improve themselves, their salesmanship, corporate training, public speaking, and most importantly for the discussion today, interpersonal skills. But he's most famously known as the author of, anybody know? Well, it's How to Win Friends and Influence People. So before he was known as the author of this particular book, he had been conducting these business education courses in New York for actually more than 20 years. And it was in 1934 that a guy named Leon Shimkin, who was a businessman that actually helped to grow Simon & Schuster into one of the major publishing houses of all time, even today, took one of Carnegie's 14-week courses on human relations and public speaking. He was so impressed with Carnegie that afterwards, Shimkin persuaded him to let a stenographer sit in on one of his courses and take notes that they then planned to revise into a publication. And those notes actually became How to Win Friends and Influence People. The book was published a couple of years later in 1936, and over that time there was actually a lot of research put into it, but besides just the stenographer's notes. And in 1936, when it was released, it sold really, really well. The first 5,000 copies sold out almost immediately, and it went through 17 editions in the first year alone. I wasn't able to actually find accurate numbers on the number of editions because there are just so many editions available since that time, including ebook options today. However, the book remains incredibly popular and still sells really, really well. So this is a cover of one edition that's still on sale. It's from 1986, and it celebrates the 80th anniversary of the book. And I wanted to share some notable statistics about the book itself. In 2011, it listed in Time Magazine's article on the 100 most influential books of all time. And it was important for, I think, the resurgence in the sales of the book, but it has continued to be one of the most popular in the genre. Wikipedia also says that it sold about 30 million copies, which puts it on par with more recent bestsellers like Hunger Games. It's still only about 20% of Lord of the Rings, but interestingly, it sold 50% more copies than The Good Soldier Fake, which has sold about 20 million copies. So Carnegie's inspiration for the book, he talks about in the intro. And he tells this story about why he agreed to turn his lectures into a book and where the content actually came from. He said that in the years he conducted his public speaking courses, he realized that as much as the adults he was teaching needed training in effective speaking, they needed still more training in what he called the quote unquote fine art of getting along with people in everyday business and social contexts. He even felt he was in need of such training, but there didn't seem to be any book publications that really filled the need. His research conducted by his foundation found at that time that about 15% of financial success was due to technical knowledge, and about 85% was due to the skill that people had in what he called human engineering and the ability to lead people. Maybe those numbers are a little bit different today, but I think that there's still no doubt that despite some famous exceptions who really just willed themselves to success despite being kind of unhappy or unpopular people, Steve Jobs, for example, most of us succeed in part because of the skills, the soft skills that we have. So in preparation for his course and subsequently the book, Carnegie said that he read everything that he could find on the subject. Newspaper and magazine articles, records of the family courts even for some reason, the writings of old philosophers. He hired a researcher and they together spent about 18 months poring over everything that they can find on the topic, including over 100 biographies of Theodore Roosevelt alone. They read 100 biographies of Theodore Roosevelt. They interviewed famous inventors like Marconi and Edison, political leaders like Roosevelt, business leaders, and even movie stars. And all of this was in an effort to discover every practical idea that anyone had ever used throughout time for winning friends and influencing people. So then we get to, why did I choose Carnegie? Why am I doing this brown bag? Well, to be honest, I was actually reluctant to do the brown bag. Rozzy talked me into it. I've done only one before because, like a lot of people, I'm not really crazy about public speaking. I think I do okay with it, but it's not something that I really want to do often. I have to work myself up to it. The inspiration for this talk actually came from Katarina. We were kind of going through a difficult time with a client a while back, and she can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like she kind of felt herself that she was banging her head against a wall, trying to convince them that she really knows her job well. I think she was losing patience, running out of ways to kind of deal with the situation. And anyway, she paid me a really nice compliment. Really made me feel good about how I was working with the client at the time. She told me that she thought that I handled them well and asked if I could maybe give a talk or some tips about communicating with clients. So I agreed to do that, and we did that kind of informally. And it took about 6 months for this brown bag to happen, but here it is. So anyway, before that happened, we sat down and we discussed a plan on how to deal with the client. And it wasn't so much that we wrote down some devious scheme on how to get what we wanted, but we talked about strategies that I used and have been kind of successful with over time. And we've been executing on those techniques and what we discussed then ever since then. And as you probably saw during the demo today, I don't want to specifically call anybody out, but you saw in one of the demos today that despite some hardships on the project in the past, things have really, really improved. And I think that this is a big part of it. So, as I said, the compliment she paid me really did make me feel good about the work I was doing. And that's where we are today. So anyway, to my surprise, that move, let me back up a little bit. In addition to the dev meetings that we have today, if you remember a while back, I sort of injected into the dev meeting an announcement about recognizing people's work anniversaries. Well, Katarina was part of that group. And since it received some pushback, I decided to ask the people that were called out at that time how they felt about that. And Katarina was pretty honest with me. She said, well, it seemed to me like it was a psychological trick to make us feel more happy and appreciated. And I really appreciated that feedback. In any case, I had Katarina's permission to actually use this Slack message that she sent me. I thought it was funny. I wanted to share it with you because it is kind of relevant to today's presentation. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. So what's the goal today? If it wasn't already obvious, we're going to be talking about interpersonal communication. Communication with our own colleagues, with clients. And I want to make clear that I don't consider myself an expert in this area at all. And I probably fail in my own communication with others more often than I succeed. I'm only here to talk about what Carnegie said, go over his book and the concepts and the techniques that he presents there, and show how some of these techniques have helped me in real life situations, in particular here at Salsita. So I hope you walk away from today having learned a little bit of something about yourself. And I'll warn you up front that most or all of what I'm going to talk about today is probably old news. A lot of it is really just common sense. And when I say old news, literally, remember that this book was published in 1936. I hope it still causes you to think a little bit about your own communication style, and that you walk away thinking a little bit more or having a greater awareness of how you approach communication here at Salsita with your colleagues, with our clients, and even with your friends and families at home. The reason I chose Carnegie and How to Win Friends and Influence People is probably the same reason why his work is still popular today. I really feel like he offers really insightful advice in dealing with people through simple to understand concepts and techniques. And I think there are things that we can all employ pretty easily. So you may have noticed there's an asterisk here. There are 4 sections to the book. And the asterisk is because there actually used to be 6 sections in the book. But in 1981, when it underwent a revision to modernize it, 2 sections were removed. And I thought it was kind of funny. One section was on effective business letters, and the other was on improving your marital satisfaction. This is a true story, really. Those sections are not in today's editions of the book. So the 4 parts are fundamental techniques in handling people, ways to make people like you, how to win people to your way of thinking, and be a leader. The be a leader actually has a subcontext, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So I'm going to skim over some of them because each of these sections has between, 6 and 12 subsections describing the techniques that Carnegie puts forward. And I'll tell you what they all are, but in the interest of time and your continued attention, I'll highlight only those that I think are relevant to us or have the greatest relevance anyway, and those that I can actually show some real life examples of. So the first section is the fundamental techniques in handling people. And the first of the 3 or so kind of major points that that Carnegie makes is don't criticize, condemn, or complain. So this may be probably the most common sense of all the techniques. We try to do this as a normal part of our conversation with people in general, or at least most of us do. But I think we all agree that criticizing a client is a bad thing in general. People immediately go on the defensive when they're criticized, and especially publicly, or worse, if they're somehow humiliated. And once that happens, there's really no way that you're going to get them to be willing to do what you ask of them. So it's really important that we don't criticize, condemn, or complain too much, too loudly, or too often. The second is give honest and sincere appreciation. You remember Kutka's psychological trick Slack comment to me? Well, we had discussions about this maybe being somewhat cultural, American versus everybody else, basically. But I also feel like better understanding comes from personal experience with people. So the key here is that the appreciation, whatever form that takes, if it's an announcement at a meeting or anything else really needs to be honest and sincere. And a lot of that comes from, I think, some personal interaction with people and understanding the kind of person that they are. The fact that that announcement was somehow interpreted differently is my failure. It's possible that I should have asked people up front if they minded being called out. I do that now actually with things like baby and wedding announcements. I always let people know or ask them actually beforehand if I can mention them on the meeting. And almost universally it's a yes. So the announcement that I made back then and those that I make today, having some context is really, really important. So the appreciation that we're showing really is honest and sincere. But unless you have that personal connection, it's really hard to make that clear. Carnegie talks about this, I guess it's a little bit of an antiquated phrase, but he talks about the need to arouse in other people an eager want. And in the book, he talks about when, as a young man and even a boy, he would go fishing in Maine during the summers. He says that he himself is personally very fond of strawberries and cream, but that for some reason fish prefer worms. So he went fishing and he didn't bait his hook with strawberries and cream because that's what he wanted. Instead, he baited his hook with worms or grasshoppers, and he dangled that in front of the fish and said, "Hey, fish, wouldn't you like to have some of that?" And that's really what it's talking about. You need to really understand the person that you're talking to and understand what their motivations are and put yours aside, because your needs, your desires, your wants are really irrelevant to anybody else but you. People only become eager to work with us and for us if we can achieve some mutual understanding of the objectives. So Carnegie wanted to catch a fish, and he understood that the only way to get that fish to agree to be caught was to show him what he wanted. Strawberries and cream wasn't really going to cut it. So the second section is ways to make people like you. And I think we're not here just talking about making friends or really even just about making people like you. But we all know that people liking you is a much better way to get them to agree with you, to speak with you, to work with you, than if they don't like you. That's a real barrier to cooperation. The first technique that he introduces here is become genuinely interested in other people. He says you can make more friends in 2 months by being interested in them than in 2 years by making them interested in you. So it's really not about creating this image of somebody that should be interesting and should be liked, but it's really about making people understand that they're the more interesting person in the relationship. And he believes that it's the only real way to make quality, lasting friendships, that you need to be genuinely interested in people and their interests in order for that to happen. This one may make you smile, actually, but he recommends smiling all the time about everything. And he quotes Abraham Lincoln, who once remarked that most folks are about as happy as they make up their minds to be. What that means is that happy people are more fun to be around. It's more likely that people will be happy to be with you if you're a happy person. Nobody likes to be around a downer. And one of the ways that you can convey that you're a happy person is by smiling a lot. And it's a little bit like, the context and the way that you present yourself are two sides of the same coin. So it's not just about what you say, but about how you say it. So if you came home and you said, good dog, your dog probably isn't going to be jumping up and down, wagging his tail, happy to see you, right? But if you came home and you said, bad doggy, come here, bad doggy, he's going to be all over you, licking your face and really happy to see you. And a smile is one of the ways that you can actually communicate that you're in a good mood, you're happy, you're glad to be around the people that you're with. This is an interesting one. Remember and use people's names. I think we've all been to gatherings where we have been faced with many, many people in a room. And you introduce yourself to a whole bunch of people and you immediately forget their names. Well, in business and our personal lives, when we remember people's names, we make ourselves memorable. So I've actually worked on this over time. And when I'm introduced to somebody, if I don't immediately register it, I'll introduce myself and be absolutely honest about it and say, hey, look, I just shook your hand, but I've already forgotten your name and I don't really want that to happen. So can we do this all over again? It usually gives people a chuckle and we have a little laugh about it. And it also helps to reinforce that person's name so that I can use it again later. Also, be a good listener and encourage others to talk about themselves. This is a pretty straightforward one. We won't go into too much detail here. Next one is talk in terms of other people's interests, same thing. And I think a lot of these are related and a little bit repetitive. So if you really want me to stop and talk about any of these along the way, please just interject and I'll go into it a little bit more. Make others feel important and do it sincerely. This one actually has a real life example. The same project that we talked about before. We were faced with a situation where we really needed some things to happen to make the job that we do effective. And one of the ways that we did that was that we again put aside our own feelings on the whole thing and really tried to make the client feel important in the job that they were doing. And it really, really did have a major effect on improving the situation. So on to section 3, 12 ways to win people to make to your way of thinking. So the best way to win an argument is to avoid it. I think this is probably the most famous of the quotes that have come out of the book. And I think, and this is my own interpretation of this, that surprises are a failure in communication in many cases. And surprises can cause arguments because people don't expect that they're coming. So it's really, really important to be open, find common ground on issues so that there isn't really an opposition relationship, but that you're working together to really find a solution to whatever problem is facing you. Again, pretty common sense, but it's really important to show respect for other people's opinions. Never say you're wrong, but address the issue itself. So it's not really about being right or wrong, it's about finding a solution to the issue. In the case that you are wrong, though, it's really important to admit it quickly and emphatically. Like, don't make any bones about it. You were wrong. You were 100% wrong. There's no question about that. And a lot of times this has a way to diffuse what can potentially be a really difficult situation. Carnegie uses an example where a young cashier in a grocery store makes a mistake and somehow manages to give $20 change that he should not have given. Now, this situation could go one of two ways. He can go back to the manager's office at the end of his shift, and the manager can be really, really upset because he's defensive and doesn't understand why he should be in trouble. Mistakes happen all the time. But that kind of approach doesn't always work, right? But if he were to go back to the manager's office at the end of the day and say, oh my God, I don't know what I did. I really made this huge mistake. You should probably fire me. That type of approach has a way to really put people off their guard and minimize the problem rather than escalate the problem or make it bigger than it actually is. So very often you'll find that admitting that you're wrong quickly and without a doubt really has the way to win people over to your side of the argument. Always begin in a friendly way. Just a quick little example of what I mean by this. Many, many years ago, I bought a television in the States. And I had gone to the store, the first store actually, because I had called ahead. They said they had one in stock, and I was, when I got there, it turned out that they didn't have it in stock. And I had actually traveled quite a long way to get it. Well, I was pretty upset. I was frustrated having made the long trek. And I could have been really upset about it, made a scene, but I didn't. Basically said, hey, look, I really appreciate you guys trying to find another one in another store. And it really turned out in the end to be okay because they managed to find one in another store, get it to there in, I don't know, even somebody's personal car. And if I had approached it in a different way somehow, it probably would not have turned out quite so positively in the end. Start your interactions with people with questions to which others will say yes. And I think this is a really intuitive way to get people going. It's similar to the trick that when you're talking with somebody, you nod your head up and down like in a yes motion, that people start to mimic your motions, right? And it gets them into more of a mood where they're going to be a little bit more open to what you have to say. And this is really similar. You're developing a pattern of how people answer questions. So emphasize the things on which you can agree, and people will often readily follow that lead. This is a really good one, and one that I'm failing at the moment, but let others talk more than you. People really enjoy talking, not listening to others boast. Let them rationalize, talk about the idea, because in Carnegie's words, he said, it tastes much sweeter to them in their own mouth. So don't tell people, lead them to the answer themselves. And this one's very similar. So, it's okay to let people feel like ideas are their own. We inherently like ideas that we come up with. And it's, even though we may agree with other people, it's much sweeter for us when we arrive at solutions and conclusions on our own. Try honestly to see things from others' points of view. With this one particular client, we had a technical discussion that we tried to push through for months, or a technical suggestion rather, for months, if not years. We tried everything to get that recommendation accepted. And again, it felt like we were banging our heads against the wall. We weren't getting anywhere. But more importantly, we started to see signs of irritation in the client, and that worried us a little bit. So our goal was not just to impose our will on the client. We really felt that the effort that we were trying to push through was going to improve the project and in some way make the lives of the Salsita engineering team easier, and as well as the client. But it really wasn't until we stopped to understand that this particular argument was putting somebody on the client's side in a difficult position, where he himself was kind of stuck between perhaps agreeing with our proposal, but facing some internal pushback. So once we were able to honestly see things from that point of view, we were able to move on. And I think this is also very similar. It's a carry on from that last point. It's not only important to see other points of view, but to acknowledge them. And with that same client, we had a call where we said, okay, we see this is putting you in that bad position, and we really don't want that. We're sorry, we'll back off of it. And if you feel like you want to move forward on this, you know where to find us. And more importantly, I think once that happened, it was almost like a weight had been lifted off of our shoulders as well. We chose to stop making it an issue, and it was no longer an issue. It was only an issue because we were pushing so hard to make it happen. So this is an interesting one, appeal to the nobler motives. So everyone likes to be somehow glorious in their own eyes, right? That they're the righteous one in the conversation. And people believe that they do things for noble and morally upright reasons. We can appeal to that in others if we want them to follow a particular path. So if we can convince them that one way is the morally superior or the more noble path to take, then very often that will happen. Dramatize your ideas. I think this is a really important one. And to simplify this, the truth isn't good enough anymore. And I think it's really obvious with television, with newspaper, with quote unquote news today. The truth doesn't necessarily even need to be true anymore, but it needs to be vivid, it needs to be interesting, and it needs to be dramatic. So if you can actually make what you have to say interesting and dynamic, then people are more likely to agree with it. Matt, I know, is fond of this one, and we've been trying to do more and more of this, but there's really nothing more motivating than a challenge. And I think that the people that we have at Salsita understand that better than most. Boring work is neither motivating nor challenging. And what we try to do as a company is provide projects that provide both. And when people are faced with a challenge, they will very often rise to meet those challenges, even if they themselves feel like they're not capable of it. In the end, things more often than not will turn out okay. We're getting there. This is the last major part. And some of these we're going to skip over pretty quickly. So part 4 is be a leader. How to change people without giving offense or arousing resentment. Some of these you'll see have, again, some antiquated language, but in general, I think the concepts are still pretty easy to understand. Begin with praise and honest appreciation. People will work wonders when they're praised and appreciated. But like we talked about earlier with the psychological trick, is that the context is really, really important. The praise needs to be honest. It needs to be sincere. Never call attention to people's mistakes directly. No one likes to make mistakes, and we especially don't like to be called out on those mistakes, and even more so in front of other people. people appreciate us more and are more likely to improve if we don't scold and humiliate them, but we point out the mistakes that are made and find ways collectively to work to either fix or improve them. I talked about this earlier when we discussed the cashier example, but it's important to talk about your own mistakes before criticizing others. Because if you start to criticize others right out of the gate, it somehow elevates you in their eyes above them. You're somehow better than them. When something goes wrong, take responsibility, help win others to your side. People don't like to shoulder all the blame themselves. So taking credit for some of the mistake helps to remove the sting from our critique of others. And actually, this is one of the things that drew me to Salsita. When I interviewed, I spoke with Tomasz Verzela, and he told me that one of the things that he liked most about working at Salsita was, one, that it was nothing but really senior people. You only ever had to ask for something once. The second thing was that there was zero of a blame culture at Salsita, and I have experienced that for the last 2 years. We never point fingers. We always, through retros or even interpersonal communication, find common ground, understand that every mistake we made, whether it's you or me or anybody, is really a learning situation where we can take that experience, learn from it, and more importantly, share it with others so that they don't make the same mistakes. So rather than giving direct orders, we can ask questions. And we ask questions in order to find the root cause of the problems. So we can boost others' confidence and allow them to learn quickly from their mistakes by trying to identify what the actual problem is, not by finger pointing and blaming. Let other people save face. Basically, this means that we try to preserve their dignity, because nothing diminishes that more than an insult to someone's pride, and especially if that's around other people. There's no better way to shut people down and close them off to your suggestions if that happens. Finally, praise improvements. In the book, there's a quote that says, "Abilities wither under criticism, but they blossom under encouragement." If we really want people to improve at something, we should praise that improvement. We shouldn't criticize the steps back, but we should encourage the steps forward. Finally, give others a reputation to live up to. I have an undergraduate in sociology, and so I have some understanding of human behavior from a psychological and a social point of view. And this is basically what we call labeling theory. So if you give someone a label, they tend to fulfill that label. So if someone, a student is called by their teacher to be the troublemaker in the class, very often they will try to live up to that reputation. Well, it has a positive side as well. So if we attribute a good reputation to people, they tend to live up to that. They will desire to embody the characteristics of the personality that we have given them. So this is why it's important to build people up, not tear them down. And again, very similar, use encouragement. Make faults seem easy to correct. And this is true whether we're talking about project tasks or issues that we may be facing. If we make them small enough to feel like they're surmountable, then we have a better chance of actually completing them. And then finally, make others happy about doing what you suggest. If we want to influence people and become effective leaders, we have to learn to frame our desires in terms of others' desires. So that's really it about the techniques. I know we kind of zoomed through them. I've provided some references here to the information that I pulled for this particular presentation, including the book itself. But there are some other great references here, especially this YouTube video. It's an animated book review I think that you guys would really enjoy. And that's really it for today. Carnegie called How to Win Friends and Influence People an action book. And he called it that because Herbert Spencer, a 19th century English philosopher, once said that the great aim of education is not knowledge, but action. So I hope that you feel inspired, as I was, to read the book and put some of these techniques into action, because despite their age, I think that these techniques really hold up well and we can all learn a little bit from them. Thanks very much for your attention. I know that we ran a little bit longer than I planned, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. All right, no questions then. Please, I would ask if you have any feedback for me on how I could improve for the next brown bag. I would really appreciate it. Just reach out to me on Slack. Thanks very much. Everyone have a great day.